Tal com manifesta el lema d'aquesta jornada, ens centrarem en la investigació i la innovació als arxius dels museus. I precisament la primera ponència que obre aquesta trobada analitza alguns dels reptes que poden sorgir a l'hora de gestionar arxius en un museu. El primer ponent d'aquest seminari ens vol parlar directament d'aquesta qüestió i per això la seva ponència porta per títol Els reptes del canvi, la gestió dels arxius del Victoria and Albert Museum. Serà càrrec del senyor Matti Watton, ell és arxivist sènior del Victoria and Albert Museum, responsable dels arxius dels museus, la gestió de registres i les col·leccions externes. Això inclou el desenvolupament de les col·leccions, la preservació analògica i digital i la catalogació. La seva experiència passa també per la National Gallery, els arxius parlamentaris, la Biblioteca Britànica i la del Palau de Lambert. Bon dia, senyor Watton, des d'aquest Museu Marítim de Barcelona. Benvingut.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and thank you so much for the invitation to come and speak to you today. It's a real honour to have the opportunity to be fascinating conference. It's great for me to be here in person in Barcelona. I'm English, and I live in London. My father's English, but my mother is from Finland, Northern Europe, so I'm not used to seeing such mild weather in March. Really pleasing. I am indeed a senior archivist at the Victoria and Albert Museum, which normally abbreviates into the V&A. And there I lead an archive section of currently 14, including project staff. And I manage a range of internal and external collections.
Aha, louder. Can you hear me now? Apologies for that. You haven't missed anything interesting. It's okay. So yes, I lead a team, currently 14, including project staff, and we manage a range of internal and external collections, and whether that's their preservation, storage, access. We do records management, so whether that's traditional paper or increasingly digital, and we're also responsible for engagement, promotion and outreach work. And I've been there for about 2.5 years. It's been a time when there's been a lot happening, a period of significant change. And what I wanted to do was to highlight some of those key changes and how our context and circumstances are contributing to both the opportunities we have and also the challenges we face. I think in a museum of over 1,000 staff, an archive section like mine can potentially have a low profile. But at the same time, within the museum, I think the respect for the archive collections is pretty strong. We have good usage, whether it's by staff or the general public. But I think when you work in archives in a museum, you tend to have to accept that it's the museum objects which will tend to take priority. That's where the museum's focus and resources will tend to be in the main. But a little bit of introduction for those of you not familiar with the V&A. The V&A is actually a family of museums dedicated to the power of creativity. Its focus is on design and the applied arts. We've got over 2.8 million items spanning 5,000 years of history, and they go from ancient Chinese ceramics through to modern fashion. And I suspect most people, if they've heard of the museum and they think of a building, they probably think of this one. Yes, the pointer's working. Yep, pointer's working. Which is the main building in South Kensington in London. That front was constructed between 1899 and 1909. Here it is from the air. It's a part of the city with lots of other museums. You can see the Natural History Museum here, the Science Museum there. The V&A has its origins in the 19th century. So it's in effect a legacy of the Great Exhibition of 1851. Most people would think of the South Kensington Museum, which was founded in 1857 as the museum's predecessor. The South Kensington Museum was an extraordinary mix of art, science, those science collections now within the Science Museum, but much more than that. So architecture, food, manufacturing. So the V&A is a museum with a rich and fascinating history, and the archives very much reflect that. And if you were to go into V&A South Kensington today, these are the sorts of displays you would see. We're strong in sculpture, decorative art, so metalwork, glass, textiles, fashion, theatre and performance, and photography, and again, much more. But the V&A is more than simply its most famous building in South Kensington. It is a family of sites. So, for example, since the 1870s, it has managed a site in East London, in Bethnal Green, which you can see here. It's had changing uses over time, but most recently it has been the Museum of Childhood, and recently it has been relaunched as Young V&A, as you can see here. Again, a museum dedicated to design and creativity, but now very much with a focus on young people. Then there's V&A Dundee. That's Scotland's design museum, relatively new organisation, which was opened in 2018. In effect, a separate organisation with its own director and board, but still part of the V&A family. And then there's V&A Wedgwood collection, which is based just outside Stoke-on-Trent in the English Midlands. So Wedgwood, the world famous manufacturer of pottery and ceramics, founded in the 18th century, still very active. The business is owned by a multinational, Fiskars, but the V&A owns the historic collections of Wedgwood. And that includes an excellent archive, probably the world's foremost archive relating to pottery and ceramics, including both business records of Wedgwood from the 18th century, but also some personal and family papers. And the archives there are managed by a separate team with strong links to my team, but using the same procedures, catalogue, and so on. And most importantly, for this concept of family of sites, the V&A is about to open 2 new buildings, again in East London, in a place called Stratford, which is where the 2012 London Olympics were held. And one of those is V&A East Museum. This one here, that's due to open next year. And most importantly for the archives, a new research and collections centre, V&A East Storehouse, which is this building here, which is due to open at the end of May. And this is a rendering of what it's going to look like. And that is going to play a big part in the future of our archives. So that's what the V&A is. What are its archives? Well, they divide into sections. So first of all, we're responsible for managing the institutional archive. So the records created by the staff and departments, and they date from the 19th century. So that would include material from predecessors such as the South Kensington Museum. And in effect, that archive has grown out of a registry service, a sort of centralised record keeping system, which started many decades ago. Hence, you can see here some sort of files which come from that system. But it's a very varied archive representing all aspects of the museum's activity over time. But we're also very active in collecting from external sources. So we are the home of the Archive of Art and Design, which has material from UK-based designers and design companies, and that might relate to furniture, fashion, graphic design, textiles, glass, and so on. And that's material that the museum has collected for a long time, but it used to be in disparate parts of the museum up until the 1970s, when it was brought together as a more coherent archive with a more established collecting policy. And then there's the archives of theatre and performance. So these were founded on the basis of one collection, which was the gift of Gabrielle Enthoven, who you can see here, and she gave her theatrical material to the museum in 1924, and from that has grown a large archive from related to theatre and performance. And as part of that, the museum has recently acquired probably its biggest archive collection, namely the archive of the musician David Bowie. And the new Research and Collection Centre storehouse will have a dedicated part for the David Bowie archive. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. And the final collecting area, well, because the museum has traditionally managed the Museum of Childhood, now Young V&A, we've also tended to collect material relating to childhood and learning. So those are the archives that my section manages, but I suspect this will be familiar to some of you. It's more complicated than that. So within a museum, there are other archive collections which are managed differently. So, for example, this here is the National Art Library. So that's been part of the V&A since the 19th century. It is in effect the UK's foremost reference library for material relating to art and design. And it has over 1 million printed books, but it also has special collections. It has manuscript collections. It has some archives like the diaries of the first director of the South Kensington Museum, Henry Cole. Then there's the Prints and Drawing Study Room, managed by a curatorial department, and some of those collections one might think of as part of the museum archives. And then here we have, that's being unpacked, that's the archives of the Royal Photographical Society, which again are managed by a curatorial department. And you might ask, well, why is the landscape so complicated? Well, I think it's partly because of organisation, history, but also because we often have discussions about when is an object a museum object, when is it an archive, when is it part of the library. And I think from my perspective, the main point in all of that is that the user should be our main consideration. So when we produce displays like this, we will often include material from museum collections and also material from the archives. And I think to the user, it shouldn't matter too much how things are being managed. So here's an example. The Stormtrooper is not part of the archive, museum collection. But where it does matter is when it affects how those collections are accessed. It's important that we communicate that and ensure that our users can engage with the material that they would find of interest. So it might affect where material is catalogued or how it is consulted. I'm going to move on then to those aspects of change which we're experiencing, which are quite varied. And first of all, there's the archive's growing and developing relationship with our research department, which originated during the period of COVID restrictions. So, like many museums, during the period of when we were closed during COVID restrictions, that put in place quite a significant financial challenge on the museum, and that prompted a degree of restructuring. And the archive section was part of that. And I don't think that's unusual for archives and records functions to potentially be moved within an organisation. And previously, the archives were part of a department which had quite a strong, I suppose, curatorial and traditional focus. Whereas now we're part of a newly configured department, Varanala, which has the National Art Library, which the archives were always linked to, but also our research institute. The V&A is quite a research active organisation. Now the archives sit within the same department. And as an archives team, that has given us closer access to research projects, conversations about potential university partnerships. We're supervising more PhD students. The V&A has a long-standing relationship with the Royal College of Art to run a history of design course. So we're more involved with that. We're contributing to more publications. And in a sense, the archives have always done that. Have always supported researchers in their work and contributed to published outputs. But I think now we're very much within those conversations from the start. That said, it is definitely a new way of working, not just about forming new relationships, but for example, when we engage with research projects, those might have quite challenging demands on us. They might be wanting to access records which are closed or current. They might be potentially carrying out research which is going to challenge museum practice. They might sometimes have unrealistic expectations of what's possible, given perhaps the extent of our archives or the nature of the cataloguing. We spend a fair bit of time trying to give such projects a clear and achievable focus. But the main change we're experiencing is the opening of the new centre, Storehouse. And the context here is that all the collections that I mentioned, and plus semi-current records from museum departments, plus the staff who worked with them, plus our reader services, all of that was previously in this building here, Blythe House, which is about 3 kilometres, about 2 miles away from V&A South Kensington. And it was used by other museums as well for similar purposes. It was owned by the UK government, and in 2015 they announced that it was going to be sold. So the V&A faced the challenge of what it was going to do, not just with the staff and services, but with all the collections which were stored there, which were about 250,000 museum objects, over 300,000 library books, and over 1,000 archive collections. So those ones I mentioned earlier, archival art design, theatre and performance, and the ones relating to childhood and learning. So naturally, this was a big task for the museum. And from an archival perspective, the response has had various different strands. So the semi-current records that I mentioned have gone into off-site storage. We manage the contract for that, and the retrievals and the sending of material to that. The institutional archive, so the records of the museum, have moved from that building, Blythe House, to the main site at South Kensington and are now accessed via the National Art Library, the NAL. And it's remarkable that just moving those collections has now to where the vast majority of the staff are based, has helped to increase the archive profile internally and has increased usage. It's also meant that we are better plugged in to things like the environmental monitoring of the museum. But I mentioned earlier, museum collections will tend to have priorities. So did we get the store that we wanted? It's not actually that store, that's a different one. But did we get the store that we wanted for our archives? No, we're a fair distance away from where the National Art Library is on the site, which helps, which hinders retrieval sometimes. And we didn't get as much space as we wanted. The V&A has a sort of historic problem with not having enough space, and that's sort of very much with us today. Importantly, there would never have been room on this site for all the collections that were previously at Blythe House. So we've had to separate the institutional archives, which are now at South Kensington, from all the other collections. Because all the other collections are going to Storehouse. Indeed, they've already been moved there. The V&A's response to the closure of Blythe was this new building, Storehouse. Not completely new. It was actually the media centre for the 2012 Olympics, but it needed a major conversion. And the motivation for this was, first of all, to ensure that the records were and the collections were safely stored, but also very much the principle of wanting to increase access to those collections, provide better user facilities and better display spaces, in particular for the museum collections. So there is, when Storehouse opens at the end of May, there's going to be a new programme of access to museum collections, which were previously in storage. That's going to be called Order and Objects. The public are going to be able to make appointments to view those. But it was a major operation to move all the collections. And I think we within the archives section definitely benefited there from being part of a bigger cultural organisation. We had access to a team working on that move and a great deal of expertise. We also, from an archives perspective, there were other benefits, such as collections being repackaged, barcoding. We feel now, even though the collections have been moved, that we have far better location control. But at the same time, we had to close those collections to public access. We had to close them while they were being prepared. Then there was a delay because of the restrictions during COVID. Then there was a delay. They had to be closed while they were being moved, and now still closed while the building is being prepared. And at no point in that could we have like a separate program of archive access, separate from the broad picture of access to museum collections. And that has been very tough for our users. You know, we have had lots of inquiries about why the collections are still closed, and we know it's affects people's work and projects. But Storehouse is due to open at the end of May this year, and it will, from an archives perspective, give us access to specific display spaces, which we haven't had before. It will give us dedicated terminals for accessing digital material, and we will be sitting alongside that order and object program for access to museum collections, and we think that will give us better opportunities for engagement and outreach. There has been a lot that we have needed to navigate. That's not just the move of the collections, but now how we're planning our services, because the way the public will engage with museum collections in terms of how long they will need to see things, how many they will order, and all of that, very different from archive usage. There's a lot of discussion about how collections will be invigilated, collections care, and so on. And I think also that programme of access to museum objects will be quite high profile, and there is a risk that the access to archives won't have quite the same focus. So I mentioned the David Bowie archive, which will have its own dedicated space at Storehouse, the new centre. So Bowie's archive is about 80,000 items. About 1,500 of those are museum objects, so fashion items, awards, musical instruments. They're being catalogued and managed by the relevant curatorial department. But about 79,000 are archives, so photographs, correspondence, other paper, and indeed some born digital material. And we've currently got a project team of 3 working on the cataloguing and the preparation of that. And within the centre, there will be a display area for Bowie items, and also a dedicated reading room. And that's due to open in September. And it's interesting, when you get a collection like this, which is not only very large, but it's quite high profile, it's attracted quite a lot of interest. There are consequences which you might not necessarily have thought of. So internally, it has led to definitely greater interest in the archives. And one example would be our online archives catalogue, which is separate from the catalogue of the museum collections, is quite dated. So it needs a refresh, it needs functionality improved, and it needs a better look and feel. And we, within the archive section, so my predecessor, have been working hard for a long time to try and do something about this. But, and I suspect this is familiar to many of you, in order to do that, we have to make the business case for it. We have to get onto the digital roadmap, and potentially, if something else comes along relating to an existing museum exhibition, for example, we might move further down the queue. But one senior manager, when we knew we were getting the Bowie archive, asked, well, where is it going to be catalogued? We said, well, it's going to be on the archive catalogue. They took a look at the archive catalogue and said, well, I think you need to improve the functionality and the look and feel of this. So it's definitely making a bit of progress up the queue to be improved. Bowie was a very influential musician, but I'm not sure he would have anticipated his influence on archive cataloguing. Anyway, another thing is that because it's a high-profile collection, it tends to get the attention of the media. That can be good, of course, because it means that our archives become better known. But when we put out a press release relating to the opening of Storehouse, which is at the end of May, we mentioned the Bowie archive, and that won't open. That part of the centre won't open until September. Lots of media stories focused on this collection rather than the others. I think that's life. I'm going to move on to another sort of area of challenge and change, which does have a relationship actually with Storehouse, the new centre, and that's the development of our archives, both external collecting and also internally our records management work. So these ones on the left here, they're from the external collections, archive, art and design, and theatre and performance. And it's a big part of our work. So whether it's taking material by donation, bequest or purchase. And while we've been getting Storehouse ready, the physical acceptance of new material has had to be virtually exclusively paused because firstly the collections were being moved and prepared, and now the building isn't quite ready to take them physically. What hasn't paused is the work on potential acquisitions. So we have over 150 ongoing conversations about new material, whether from individuals or organisations, and we're expecting that to increase when Storehouse opens, partly because there has been a pause for so long, and also because our profile is likely to increase. And I think the number is very high. I think we benefit from having excellent and varied collections, but also the V&A, and I suppose I would say this, has quite strong brand value. You know, people have a very sort of generally quite a positive view of it. It means they really want their collections to come to us. And so when we suggest alternative homes for which it might be more appropriate, those can be quite difficult conversations. We get suggestions of new material, probably not quite every day, but certainly every week. They might come through our curatorial departments, just general public inquiries, lots of different routes. And we find that at the V&A there is something of an assumption that we are well resourced to take new collections. So when you have a grand old building, you have a new one as well, there's an assumption that our resources are extensive. In fact, when it comes to actually purchasing archives, if it's something major, certainly like Bowie, then we have to fundraise separately. And really the only way of dealing with that is to have an effective collecting policy, an understanding of the gaps, and some clear exclusions. But this can be a very, very tough area of our work. We're in the process of reviewing the collecting policy to sort of assess what is feasible. And then within records management, well, records management at the museum is integrated. So that the same staff who work on records management with departments, say we work on institutional archives, which sounds all joined up and exciting, and to a degree it is, but that's only two of us who work on that. We are well supported by legislation and regulation. So the museum's records are covered by the UK's Public Records Act. And we are a designated place of deposit for them, for storing them. We're also subject to freedom of information, and I handle our freedom of information requests. We get about 80 to 100 a year. When there is a news story in Britain about something controversial in relation to museums, I'll leave you to work out which ones those have been over the last year or two. But I always think that we are going to get freedom of information requests relating to our work in that area, and that tends to be the case. They can be quite challenging, but also there's actually a profile benefit for them, because there are some parts of the museum for whom their main interaction in relation to sort of broader record keeping work is when we get freedom of information request. Certainly if the director contacts me, it's more likely to be about an FOI request than anything else. But within the archives team, we're responsible for record keeping policy, guidance, support. For example, we're currently reviewing the organisation's retention schedules. I suppose we find that a cooperation with museum departments is generally okay, but it can vary. I think there's some departments that are very strong on realizing that the records of today are the archives of the future. Often it depends on whether they're using the collections. But for a lot of departments, when we're doing that work, we really have to focus on the key benefits to them as staff and to the benefits to the museum. I think that's certainly true when it comes to departments at sort of the sharp end, like commercial and development. For some, we very much focus on issues of risk, for example, those parts of the museum collecting a lot, which have a lot of personal data. Overall, we need to get the message out there to the museum staff about why the archives matter, and we can never take that for granted. So As an example, we run introductory sessions for the archive collections to ensure that we can maintain awareness. And finally, following on from our records management work is our work on digital preservation, which has understandably already been mentioned. And that's a challenge across collections of all kinds across the museum. So whether that's our corporate information, which, as you can imagine, is predominantly born digital now, but also all those external collections now, which contain significant amounts of digital material, and that's ever increasing. In fact, the biggest born digital collection in the museum is an archive collection. It's the National Video Archive of Performance, normally known as NVAP, where we record theatrical performances and store them in the archive. And the museum's position on digital preservation, I think, is that within the sort of archive section, there's been a long recognition of the challenges that presents. And so for a long time, we've had, I think, a good understanding of what we hold, and we've set up some basic transfer procedures and ingest procedures, which have ensure we generate checksums and software like Droid and so on. But that hasn't been integrated up until the last year or two. But there's been greater attention given to this. And one might ask why that is. Well, I think it's partly because the scale and the complexity of the digital challenge is ever growing. We are simply getting more content, more systems, more types of digital asset. I also think there's a gradual change in personnel and culture. I think we're getting an increasing number of staff who are comfortable with digital. We're doing more work on things like digital engagement. But I think the main reason from a record keeping perspective, why there's been more attention given to digital preservation, is the attention actually being given to digital preservation of museum objects. So the museum has been collecting born digital museum objects for a long time. Digital art, video games, software. Generally speaking, there is less of that, but they tend to be quite complex digital assets. And questions have started to be asked about the preservation of and access to those museum objects. And thankfully, and very positively, we as an archives team have been part of those developments and part of that conversation. It would have been a serious challenge if we hadn't been. So when we had a new records management and archives policy, 2023, it had a stronger focus on digital preservation. When there was a working group created relating to digital, archives are represented on it. And it's a really broad representation, actually. It shows how digital preservation is relevant across the whole of the museum. So we have representatives from technology, curatorial, collections management, collections care, also sustainability. We have a sustainability coordinator very interested in the impact of digital storage on sustainability, for example. And that's been vital for taking that work forward and also finding out about projects going on elsewhere in the museum. We're quite a large organisation. I suspect this will be familiar to some of you. There are sometimes projects going on that you don't hear anything about as early as you should. And as a consequence, we've got an updated digital audit. We've got a roadmap for the next 3 to 5 years in relation to digital preservation, and we were able to secure a new digital preservation manager post who started recently. And as an interesting anecdote on this, which I'll conclude with, when a curator and I went to our executive board and to try and make sure we got the resource for the new digital preservation manager post, it was interesting to see the reaction of the staff at that level, who obviously have very wide portfolios. So our digital director virtually immediately said, well, of course we should do digital preservation. Why are we even discussing that? Our head of collections at the time, whose focus was on more traditional collections, well, I'd briefed her in advance, so she knew what to say. Our finance director, very much a supporter, looking at and looking at risk and obviously cost and impact and those sorts of issues. But the interesting thing was, as part of that debate, there was a discussion about collecting born digital museum objects, digital art. Do we need to do that? Obviously, my curatorial colleagues would understandably say, yes, we do. If you want to represent design in the 21st century, you have to collect digital. But in a sense, that was a choice. You know, one could argue there's lots of sculpture and textiles still being made. Why don't we just collect those? But when it came to corporate information, nobody was going to argue with me and suggest that we were going to go back to using pen and ink around the whole museum. So for that one moment, I felt that archives were just a little bit ahead of museum collections in the discussion. It was an interesting moment. I hope that gives you an idea of some of the challenges that we are facing at the museum and how we're dealing with them in relation to records and archives. I think our core functions of collecting, preserving, providing access are remaining pretty constant, but change and challenges, the challenges that change present are always with us. And it just remains for me to say, I think it's muchas gracias, merci beaucoup. I did do French in school, so I should be able to cope with that. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Moltes gràcies, Matti Watton. Obrim, doncs, el torn de preguntes, si en tenen des de la sala. Sí que ens han arribat online, per tant, podem començar a formular-les, si li sembla. Senyor Watton, vostè ha fet referència a la importància de la cura dintre dels museus i en aquest sentit ens demanen com funciona la cura i la conservació dels fons als arxius dels museus.
So in terms of preservation, sorry, I'm hearing myself. So with regard to preservation, so we have for analog records, so paper and photographs, we have storage areas which are properly climate controlled with and secure, disaster planning, all the things you would say. As I mentioned earlier, we tie in with the museum's broader collection care approach in terms of our storage areas and if we have particular collection care needs, then we have a collection care department which we can call upon for conservation work. That can be complicated if it's a big part of work. If we have a major collection care activity that we need to do, then we need to budget for that, make the case for it. But in essence, for analog records, we have good, strong room areas, and as will be the case within the new Research and Collection Centre storehouse.
Gràcies. Rebem més preguntes online, no sé si n'hi haurà a la sala. Ens demanen també com veu el desenvolupament de la gestió de la informació del Victoria and Albert Museum en el futur.
That's a very good question. I think increasingly trying to meet the challenge and the direction of moving into being a digital organisation. And obviously that is partly a technological challenge. So we don't have a digital reservation system, for example. We've not traditionally had an electronic records management system when those were popular. So we need to meet the technological challenge there, but also culturally within the organisation, we need to get an increasing proportion of people thinking more deeply about how they manage digital records. I think in terms of how we work with those digital collections, the fact is we are unlikely to get, in the current climate, increasing resources for dealing with what is a rapidly increasing amount of records. So we will have to do most of our information management processes, I think, on a macro, on a higher level. So I think when it comes to appraisal, for example, there will be more appraisal at higher levels. There will probably be more basic cataloguing and metadata. I think looking ahead beyond that, we will have to try and automate as much of that as possible. So AI has already been mentioned, and we're interested in how that can affect appraisal and cataloguing procedures. And I think overall, we will just be having to meet that challenge of so much more material. And I think our information management work will increasingly be a question of risk management, whereas if you go back a generation ago, I think it was more idealistic and more lower level the way we did it.
Moltes gràcies. Tenim una pregunta també que fa referència més aviat al personal del museu. Ens demanen si el personal del museu rep formació en gestió de la informació de les dades des de l'arxiu. Si s'ofereix a tot el personal del museu formació en gestió de la informació i de les dades des de l'arxiu del museu.
Again, that's a good question because it reflects how the archives within the museum can be the subject of change, which might not necessarily be fully within its control. So the story here is that there used to be an induction session, so an introductory session for staff in relation to record keeping. And that was conducted at Blythe House, the building I mentioned that has been closed. And that was good for introducing staff to record keeping practice, also showing them some collections, and also demonstrating that building existed, because obviously not being on the main side where people work, there was a risk of people not knowing about it. And various things have happened since that. First of all, Blythe House has been closed. Secondly, during the period of COVID restrictions, that introduction more generally became an online module rather than anything you could do in person. And also the nature of the sort of training we would need to provide, I think, has changed, given that we should now be looking more at how to maintain digital records, which is still a small part of it, but needs to grow. So what we do now is slightly different. So we have an introductory session for staff on archives, which mainly includes talking about what they are, but also includes a small record keeping element. And what we do is that work I mentioned, talking to departments about record retention schedules and record keeping, includes passing on. So I have a set of record keeping guidance documents, and that retention schedule work, as we talk to departments, involves light training of staff, not necessarily all staff, in what record keeping involves. I think we need to go further. It's a good point. I think in the future, some sort of e-learning module. We already have some for things like data protection, cyber security. I think once our digital work progresses a bit more, there's probably scope for some form of e-learning course to make it more comprehensive.
Gràcies. Crec que hi havia ràpidament una pregunta des de la sala.
Sí. Hello, good morning. I would like to ask you, in reference to this part of the archive you mentioned at the beginning, relating with childhood and learning. I was wondering which documents or materials can form that part of the archive, which is like contemporary or from the 19th century as well. And if it is digitalized, or is it possible to visit, and if it is still open to new, let's say, incomes, or is it a closed collection?
No, not closed. Very much still collecting in that area. So I don't think it goes back to the 19th century. So it's far more contemporary. So it's things like toy companies and manufacturers, designers of childhood items. So yes, we are still getting potential new positions for that. In terms of priorities, I mean, being realistic, it probably comes after the Archive of Art and Design, Theatre and Performance in our level of priority for it, but still open to new acquisitions. The collections themselves are going to be at Storehouse and publicly accessible when Storehouse opens at the end of May. So we are still
And at the end of what?
May, 2 months' time. Yes, yes. So yes, they'll be open for public access and no, not a closed collection.
Thank you.
Bé, gràcies, doncs. Si no hi ha més preguntes, acabaríem aquí aquesta ponència. Moltes gràcies, senyor Watton, per la seva participació, per respondre les preguntes. Ens quedem, doncs, amb aquesta obertura al mes de maig de 2025 del Victorian Albert East Storehouse. I ara sí iniciarem el primer bloc d'experiències. Moltes gràcies.